Welcome to K&L Gates' Working Wise podcast series. My name is Joshua Rinschler, and I am an associate in the Newark office of the firm's Labor, Employment, and Workplace Safety Practice Group. In this episode of the Working Wise podcast, I will discuss misclassification of employees as independent contractors and provide some tips to employers for avoiding misclassification. There are a handful of slides that accompany this podcast. Worker misclassification occurs when an employer hires a worker and improperly designates the worker as an independent contractor rather than as an employee. Why does misclassification matter? Well, generally speaking, an employer does not withhold income tax for an independent contractor, does not have liabilities for acts of independent contractors, and such workers are generally not eligible for pension, retirement, or other benefit plans. In addition, federal and state wage and hour laws only cover employees, not independent contractors. So for these reasons, agencies such as the Department of Labor and the IRS, which claims that it loses out on billions in tax revenue every year due to misclassification, have an interest in the proper classification of workers, and it's an interest they take very seriously. Now there's a perception of rampant misclassification. In 2000, a United States Department of Labor study estimated that up to 30% of employers misclassify workers. Another federal study concluded that as many as 3.4 million workers were misclassified as independent contractors. And a third study showed that employers enjoyed savings of 26% due to misclassification. Governments have been cracking down on employee misclassification, and it's easy to see why. Because companies don't pay Social Security, Medicare, and unemployment insurance taxes for those workers classified as independent contractors, governments lose out on potentially billions of dollars in tax revenue. In the past decade, New Jersey, New York, and over 30 other states have formed task forces aimed at combating employee misclassification across all industries, and these task forces have achieved some significant results. For example, New York's Task Force on Employee Misclassification has identified more than 50,000 misclassified workers since it was formed in 2007. In California, audits and investigations of misclassification have increased 54% in the past 3 years, resulting in over $150 million in fines and penalties assessed annually against employers. Several states have enacted strict statutes meant to combat misclassification, including Illinois, New Hampshire, and Washington. And a New Jersey law that applies to the construction industry significantly increases penalties for misclassification, including heavy fines and stop work orders at sites where misclassification has been found to occur. The IRS is getting in on the act too, and is cracking down on misclassification. If your business is found to have misclassified workers, you may incur back payroll taxes, interest, and stiff penalties, not to mention a significant amount of paperwork. IRS penalties can include a fine of $50 for each Form W-2 that the employer failed to file because of classifying workers as independent contractors. In addition, since an employer will have failed to withhold income tax for a misclassified worker, it faces penalties of 1.5% of the wages plus 40% of the FICA taxes that were not withheld from the employee and 100% of the matching FICA taxes the employer should have paid, as well as interest. So how do employers avoid misclassification? Well, when in doubt about how to classify a worker, the most conservative approach would be to classify him or her as an employee. And given the lack of clear guidance and the potentially steep penalties for misclassification, it often makes sense to err on the side of treating workers as employees. In determining how to classify a worker, it's important to carefully consider the relevant factors. So let's take a look at these factors in greater detail. While the precise factors vary slightly from state to state, the factors I'm about to discuss are the ones most typically used to determine whether a worker is an independent contractor or an employee. First, is the work performed by the independent contractor different from the work routinely performed by employees? The key issue here is whether the work performed is integral to the business. If the work performed by a worker is integral to the employer's business, it is more likely that the worker is economically dependent on the employer. On the other hand, A true independent contractor's work is unlikely to be integral to the employer's business. For example, take a construction company that frames residential homes. For such a company, carpenters are integral to the employer's business because the company is in business to frame homes, and carpentry is an integral part of providing that service. Now let's say this same construction company contracts with a software developer to create software to assist the company in tracking its bids, scheduling projects and crews, and tracking material orders. The software developer is performing work that is not integral to the construction company's core business because the construction company is not in the business of developing software. Performing work that is not integral to a company's business weighs in favor of classifying a worker as an independent contractor. And of course, we can flip this example around too. Whereas for a construction company, a carpenter may be performing work that is integral to the business. If a software development firm hired a carpenter to build an addition to its office, that worker would not be performing work integral to the software firm's business. The next factor is, does the work require special skill? What we're really talking about here is managerial or business skills. So, for example, even if a worker's tasks require a high level of training and skills, if the worker does not make any independent judgments to the job site beyond the work that he is doing for that job, so if he does not determine the sequence of work, order additional materials, or think about bidding for the next job, but rather is told what work to perform and where, then this worker is not demonstrating the skill and initiative of an independent contractor. He's simply providing his skilled labor as an employee. In contrast, a worker who markets his services, determines which materials to order, and determines which jobs to bid on is more likely to be an independent contractor. Other factors to consider include, is the worker paid by the project or by the hour? An independent contractor is more likely to be paid by the project, while an employee is more likely to be paid by the hour. Will the worker set his own hours? If yes, then this tends to show that the worker is an independent contractor rather than an employee, although again, none of these factors on their own are dispositive. Will the worker use his own equipment? If the worker uses his own equipment, this favors a finding that the worker is an independent contractor. For example, an electrician who is retained specifically to rewire a company's office will likely bring his own equipment to perform the job. Courts also consider the relative investments of the employer and the worker in determining whether the worker is an independent contractor in business for him or herself. An independent contractor typically makes investments that support a business beyond any particular job, and typically, an independent contractor has at least some risk of loss. Will the worker be able to work for other companies? Obviously, if the worker can perform other jobs for other companies, this makes it more likely that the worker is an independent contractor. On the other hand, if the worker is expected to devote his time and efforts exclusively to a given employer, the worker is more likely an employee. Will the worker have more autonomy than employees? In other words, does the worker actually exercise control over meaningful aspects of the work? And a final factor to consider is whether the relationship between the worker and the employer is a permanent or indefinite one, or whether the engagement is only for a specified term or job. Permanency or indefiniteness suggests that the worker is an employee. On the other hand, an independent contractor often works one project for one employer, then another project for another, and so on, rather than working continuously or repeatedly for one employer. So what are some best practices an employer can implement in order to avoid misclassification? One such best practice is to use written agreements to define the independent contractor relationship. This written agreement can be an important piece of evidence to show that a worker was properly classified as an independent contractor. For example, the IRS will consider a written contract when reviewing independent contractor classification, although the language of the contract is not necessarily controlling. A written independent contractor agreement should outline the terms and conditions of the engagement, including when and where the work will be performed, and indicate in writing that the worker is independent and not entitled to the same benefits as an employee. But remember, A written agreement isn't a magic bullet, and it won't protect you if you treat an independent contractor like an employee. So in other words, treat employees like employees and independent contractors like independent contractors. So for example, independent contractors should be supplied with a 1099 and not a Form W-2, and they should not be provided with the same perks and fringe benefits as employees. Use the written agreement to establish the elements of an independent contractor relationship, which we discussed earlier in this podcast. Some other steps to protect against misclassification include: don't micromanage independent contractors, because control of the method of performing work is an important factor. Use independent contractors who have their own businesses. It's far less likely a worker who owns his own business will be considered an employee. And finally, avoid rehiring former employees as independent contractors. This is a somewhat common practice in some industries, but it's one that can raise red flags if a government agency is looking to find misclassified workers. It can sometimes look as though the employment relationship was ended simply as a way to avoid classifying the worker as an employee. And that concludes today's episode. We hope you enjoyed this episode of K&L Gates' Working Wise podcast series. More episodes from this series can be found at klgateshub.com, and you can learn more about the firm's labor, employment, and workplace safety practice at our main website, klgates.com. Thank you for listening, and have a great day.